Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to welcome back to my show Todd Hirsch. He's a former Calgary-based chief economist. He's now a public speaker, and he's an author of The Boiling Frog Dilemma, Saving Canada from Economic Decline. Fascinating book. But the reason I wanted to chat with him today is because he wrote an article last week in the Globe and Mail that said, as an economist, I think forecasts are a waste of time. Almost hubris. And for an economist to say that forecasts are a waste of time, I thought was amazing. And you went on to say no one in 2019 predicted a pandemic. No one in 2021 predicted a massive ground war in Europe. And no one in 22 predicted a series of bank failures. So Todd, what's wrong? Like, I thought economists were brilliant and you always knew what was going on and you forecasted well.
We're doing it wrong at an increasing rate. And, as somebody who spent the better part of the last 30 years preparing economic forecasts for various groups and not-for-profits and banks that I've worked for, it kind of does hurt me to come to this point where, I kind of throw up my hands and say, is this all trying to predict the economy? Is this all kind of a waste of time? And, part of me understands why we want to do this. And I certainly understand why people want to hear from economists. What's the economy going to do? Get out your crystal ball, people always ask me. Well, of course, we all know we don't have a crystal ball. And I don't think it's that economists are getting worse at running the econometric models. I don't think the problem is with the math or the models that we use. I think the problem is that there are an increasing number of events, what we would call black swan events, these events that come out of nowhere and really change the game entirely. And that makes, economic forecasting not only tricky, but really kind of impossible. I used to joke when I was with my former employee and they would ask me to do forecasting. I would say the secret to good forecasting is revise frequently. And because that way you're never really wrong. If you could revise your forecast every single day, you're never wrong. You could just say, well, that was the old forecast and now we have a new one. But of course, that sort of lays bare how, in some ways, how useless this economic forecasting is.
So, you used the three examples of the pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and Silicon Valley Bank and other bank failures as in your article. Let's take each one of them if we could. And you've described them as black swans, and maybe they are, but how black swan? You think about in the pandemic, we had Bill Gates and other people warning us that there was going to be another one coming. We had SARS that was sort of the smaller example of what was happening. And lots of people were saying we needed to be prepared. In Ontario, we actually had a judicial commission after SARS that said we need to store PPE, we need to store respirators, we need to, it made a judicial process, made a whole bunch of suggestions, and we started to follow them. We just didn't keep it up because we gave up, I guess, after a while. And on the war, I've had people on my show that said we should have known this because 2014 he invaded Crimea and took over the Donbass, and then in the fall there was the massing of the forces on the borders, and people just didn't want to believe what was happening. And the bank failures. You even said in your article that some economists were suggesting that bank failures just wasn't the mainstream. So is it we're just not believing the risks, or we don't want to believe the risks, or what is it?
I think what it is, and you're absolutely right, for all of those black swan events, there are people that would put up their hands and said, I said this was going to happen the whole time, 100%. But what doesn't happen is, there's no certainty. They didn't say in 2019, with certainty, a pandemic is going to hit the global economy in March of 2020. They're not able to say that. They're able to say, at some point, this is going to happen, but we don't know when. At some point, Russia is likely to invade Ukraine, but we don't know when. So as a result, economists don't really have anything, or they can't bake anything into a formal forecast. It's maybe a bit of a flaw with the system. But rather than trying to pinpoint with to a tenth of a percentage point, what the GDP is going to do, I think economists would be better, more useful to people. We would be better using our time and abilities, helping clients or helping, governments prepare for any outcome that's possible, including things like a pandemic, including a ground war. Not to say with certainty these are going to happen, but here's what the economy will do, and here's what your industry is going to have to grapple with if in fact we do see a pandemic, if in fact we do see commodity prices go through the roof because Russia invades Ukraine. I think we'd be better off using our time doing that rather than trying to predict what the GDP is going to do and get it wrong every time.
So I took a course once that really stressed Monte Carlo simulation and or sort of decision trees and probability curves. And what I took out of that, which may not be the right conclusion, but what I took about that is that don't always just plan for the baseline. Think about those extreme events and what would happen, and what should you be doing, and should you be prepared to insulate yourself and have a risk profile such that you can live with these extreme events. Is that one of the things that would sort of be the outcome of your article?
Yeah, and a lot of economists, we do this. We say there's maybe a low case, a base case, and a high case scenario for what the GDP is going to do. Of course, depending on all of these unknowns that because of the very nature, they're unknowable when or if they're going to happen. So economists do this, but people still come back and say, well, what's the base case scenario? In other words, they still want, what's the number? Is the GDP going to grow by 3%, by 5%, by -1%? They want to know that one number, even though economists might say, well, our base case would say 3% expansion. However, there's a high case scenario, there's a low case. People don't really get into the weeds. They just want to hear the headline number. And I think that's where it's a little bit dangerous putting out these forecasts. Because even though the economists like me might want to put all sorts of caveats around the forecast, people just want to say, well, Todd said the economy was going to expand by 3% and it didn't. So he's wrong. Why'd the economists get it wrong? Or even worse, a company or maybe a government might, form a whole budget around a 3% GDP growth assumption. And then, of course, that number doesn't come to fruition. I think it's, it can be a little bit dangerous in putting out these forecasts simply because the public wants to use these as a crystal ball, prediction of what's going to happen in the future.
It's fascinating because the range of outcomes this year, next year, caused by what we may call black swan events, but may not actually be that black swanish. Right. It could range from an attack on Taiwan by China to an end of the war in Ukraine, and this Silicon Valley Bank. Clearly could have led to financial contagion. That's why central bankers and financial entities moved in so quickly, because they were worried that it could lead to financial contagion. And that could have led to, I presume, a great recession, 2008, 2009, like event all over again. And right now, I don't know, is it looking like we're going to have a recession or a soft recession or not a recession?
Well, again, our base case scenario, the most likely scenario is calling for, some sort of modest recession in Canada this year. But there's no certainty that's going to happen. It could, if we did see some event like China, a wholesale invasion of Taiwan and a response from the United States and other NATO countries, then all the forecasts get thrown in the garbage again, and that soft landing or that modest recession, gets thrown out the window. Or we could see, no recession at all. We could see inexplicably the United States and Canada kind of skate through 2023 with, okay growth and no contraction at all. But I think the other thing that when we talk about these black swan events, COVID pandemic or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, When we think about these events, they are not unprecedented. We have had lots of other wars in the past. We have had other pandemics like SARS, or maybe that was an epidemic. We have had events like this, but what I think why 2023 or maybe the 21st century is different is that because the global economy is far more integrated and things move at lightning pace, these events have a much more devastating impact on the economy very immediately. We would not have seen that kind of event have the economic consequences, say, 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. But because we're so economically integrated and because everything moves so quickly, these events turn into much more significant economic factors very, very quickly. And that, again, makes trying to forecast almost impossible.
This is, one of the second issues that you talk about in the article that I want to come to, which is that the economy is not behaving the way that we typically would think of it. And that's sort of separate from the black swan events that you talked about. I love this one quote that you've got in your article from Yogi Berra about it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Todd Hirsch, a Calgary-based economist, author, and public speaker, talking about his article from the Globe and Mail. As an economist, I think forecasts are a waste of time, almost hubris. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Todd Hirsch. He's a former chief economist. He's now a author and a public speaker. He's written an article, a fascinating article, just last week in the Globe and Mail called, "As an Economist, I think forecasts are a waste of time, almost hubris." And we, Todd, before the break, spoke about some of these black swan events, and we'll probably come back to that. But you said the second reason that forecasting is difficult is that the economy, for reasons that aren't quite clear, is behaving differently than in the past. Our predictions of the future are based entirely on patterns we've observed from the past, but now those patterns are shifting. I've heard several different people, speak about this recently, saying that, the increases in interest rates should have brought the economy to a halt far more quickly or slowing down growth, and it hasn't. I've had other people talk about, well, maybe we're recreating stagflation from the 1970s. Does the Bank of Canada, the Federal Reserve, have it wrong? Do economists have it wrong? Or is the economy just not working the way it should?
Well, I wouldn't want to go on record saying the Bank of Canada has it wrong. I used to work at the Bank of Canada, and I've got a lot of respect for what they do and a lot of sympathy, actually, for the task that they're given, because they are trying to sort of navigate and steer an economy through very choppy water and, in some ways, uncharted territory. They always say that, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. So here we are, clawing our way out of a global pandemic, the worst economic downturn the global economy has seen since the 1920s and 1930s. And now we're trying to sort of fashion monetary policy with interest rates and also government policy, fiscal policy, to try to get the economy back on track or back to something normal. The problem is lots of factors, including the labor market, they're not acting like they have in the past. They're not responding in the same way, which is a bit of a puzzle. I think there are some bigger factors, social factors going on, maybe some of them related to COVID, that are leading, lots of workers to not wanting to go back to a job afterwards. That's leaving some labor shortages. So here we are, with high interest rates, rising interest rates, high inflation. The economy should be tanking, but in fact, it's not. Up until very recently, the labor market and the US and Canadian economies kept chugging along really nicely. And it was a bit of a puzzle, especially the labor market. Why is the US 3.5% unemployment, basically a record low? Typically at this point, kind of in the business cycle, you would have seen the unemployment rate much, much higher and increasing in the United States as interest rates are kind of slamming on the brakes of the economy. So the labor market.
Can we talk about that? I apologize for interrupting, but can we talk about that for a second? So I've heard a couple of different comments on that. I wonder if you could expand. So, one comment is that immigration has been so incredibly low, both legal and illegal immigration, because of COVID has been so low that has sort of diminished the size of the labor pool. And then labor force participation has gone down because of the comments you made about, people in COVID deciding they want to stay home or take new jobs or quiet quitting or the great resignation or things like that. What do you think is causing this, unbelievably, almost historically low rates of unemployment?
It's a fascinating question. I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. I do think over COVID, people did drop out of the labor market. A lot of people, including myself, decided to sort of take early retirement. I left my job of 15 years as a chief economist at a bank based here in Alberta, not because I was unhappy with the job, but I really just wanted to do something different. So at age 56, I retired. It kind of surprised a lot of people. I haven't quit working, but I did sort of drop out of that employment model. That was pretty typical. And, back in the 70s or 80s, people would have stayed in that job until age 65. But so we're seeing some shifts. We're seeing also lots of people finding alternative ways to earn income. Not necessarily illegal or illicit, but there's lots of ways to earn income. The gig economy, maybe earning some income, performing some services online, accounting services or whatever, that are outside of the traditional employment model. And when we think about the labor force survey that Statistics Canada calculates every single month, this labor force survey dates back to the 1970s, and it asks questions that in 1976, when the labor force survey was constructed, made sense. Are you working? Are you looking for work? In 2023, people might respond to that, and I don't want to suggest they're being untruthful, but they might respond to that, saying, I'm not working, I'm not looking for work. But in fact, they are earning income in some fashion. So it's giving this impression that, in fact, the unemployment rate is very, very low, that people are, employed, but they might be doing, that the participation rate is lower. People have dropped out of the labor market. But I think there are different factors and different realities of how you earn income. What does it mean to be employed in 2023 versus 1976? What does it mean to be earning income in 2023? So there's lots of different factors. I don't think you can nail it down to one single factor, but lots of different reasons, social reasons, why in fact we're getting these odd results with the labor market, low unemployment rate, while the Bank of Canada is slamming on the brakes of monetary policy.
The other comment you make about this Bank of Canada slamming on the brakes is that it should have caused a slowdown. And it doesn't seem to have caused as much of a slowdown as the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve was expecting. Why? Why is that not happening?
Well, that's the big mystery that economists and the Bank of Canada are trying to solve. Some of it, again, might be related to just psychological factors, as all of us, clawing our way out of the COVID pandemic that left a lot of scars on people. I think so many people, even if they're, it's costing them a little bit more because interest rates are higher. I think 2022, 2023, people are out spending money because in a lot of ways we haven't been able to in 2020 or 2021. So I think the COVID lifting of the COVID restrictions, I think maybe is causing consumers to react in a different way than they would have in absence of a COVID pandemic. We'll never be able to go back and repeat the experiment again because that's not the way economics works.
But you point out in your article that we're on track for a 2.5% growth in the first quarter, which is 5 times what the Bank of Canada predicted. Like, that's not getting it wrong. That's getting it really, really wrong.
Well, and like in economics, so we always say, it's usually just a matter of timing. The Bank of Canada may end up getting this right. They might have just predicted the slowdown would happen a little sooner than in fact. Now, more recent numbers since when I wrote that article suggest that we are now seeing some slowing in the Canadian economy. So the Bank of Canada, by July, they might be saying, well, we got the timing maybe wasn't quite right, but we did predict this slowdown in the economy. So time will tell. We'll have to wait and see what the summer looks like if in fact we do see this predicted slowdown in the Canadian economy. But by January, it certainly wasn't happening on the same schedule that the Bank of Canada was predicting.
So just be more patient or jack up interest rates even more?
Well, I would be fascinated to be a fly on the wall in the inner sanctum of the Bank of Canada and these meetings, because I'm sure these are the debates that they're having and their research team is having. And again, as somebody who used to work in the research department of the Bank of Canada, I know they, agonize poring over the data, trying to come to some, conclusion. What should we do? And they ultimately have to make a decision. Are we going to raise interest rates? Are we going to keep them steady, or are we going to, lower interest rates, which we might in fact see them do later in 2023 or early 24? But I'm sure these conversations among the senior leaders, the governors of the Bank of Canada and the deputy governors must be fascinating, because, what do we do? Do we continue to raise interest rates to fight inflation, or is it time to hold? And I'm sure these conversations are not unanimous. They are now releasing the minutes of some of these meetings to give us an idea of maybe the conversations that happen. But ultimately, on the fixed announcement date, the Bank of Canada has to announce a decision. And for the time being, it sounds like they are just, staying or holding pat on keeping interest rates where they're at.
It's also an interplay with what government's doing, is it not? And I think that, and we talked about this before, the government budget that was announced a little while ago was stimulative, and so that sort of counteracts some of what the Bank of Canada was trying to do. And I got to believe that this current strike by the public service workers, which is calling for like an 8, 9, something like that % wage increases, has got to be concerning, because that's unbelievably inflationary, is it not? And if that's what public service workers get, isn't that what everyone else is going to want to demand in the corporate world? And then you're just going right back into this inflationary cycle, no?
Well, and not only in the corporate world, but I'm sure provincial governments across the country are watching. They are on pins and needles watching what's going to happen here with the federal government workers, because if 9%, I think, is what the government is currently offering, the union holding out for something much higher in terms of a increase in wages. But if they are able to get a higher increase in wages, provincial employees or provincial government employees are going to, sort of want the same thing. So I can understand the dilemma that the government is having. I also certainly understand, the government workers. Their wages have not kept up anywhere close to what inflation pressures are doing. That is sort of true with most of the private sector as well. But, I have sympathy for the public workers, but I understand the dilemma that the federal government and provincial governments are in. While the Bank of Canada is trying to pull back, on the economy, we're seeing wage increases in the private sector and potentially in the public sector, making it worse, countering it.
So you go back to this sort of scenario analysis or Monte Carlo simulation. If you get wage inflation of 9, 10, whatever %, not only in the federal public service, but then, as you said, it'll happen in the public service provincially, and then maybe in the corporate world, versus holding the line in strikes. Doesn't that lead to two very different scenarios for what interest rates are going to be, what GDP growth is going to be, what inflation is going to be, et cetera?
And this sort of comes back to the premise of my article. Like, trying to forecast what is going to happen to the GDP is almost impossible, because there's so many of these factors. We just don't know how this is going to play out. So rather than saying that the economy is going to grow by 4%, we'd be better off as economists to say, well, here are a bunch of different scenarios that can play out. And here's how maybe governments or industries or individual companies, here's how you need to think about reacting in any number of these possible outcomes. We don't know which one it's going to be. At this point, there's sort of an equal probability that it could be, any of these scenarios. And then we can layer on top of that, of course, even darker scenarios like China invading Taiwan. So we don't know how this is all going to play out. And in that environment, it just makes economic forecasting not only tricky, but probably a bit of a waste of time.
So would it be all possible? Like, it'd be really wonderful if you could do it, but would it be at all possible to actually scope out a scenario where, you know, someone at the Bank of Canada says, look, if we get 10% wage agreement with the federal workers, we think it'll then go to provincial workers. We think it'll then go to corporate workers, and therefore inflation will stay high. And so therefore we're going to be increasing interest rates by 50 to 100 basis points. But if the federal workers agree to something at 5% or less, we think that's going to go through the economy and interest rates going to go down over time. And so therefore Canadian politicians and Canadian public, it's your choice. You want higher interest rates and you know, slow down in the economy, probable recession, agree to a 10% increase with your federal wages. You want a more gentle, you know, recession or no recession, and no inflation. The only way to do it is to hold the line with the federal employees and agree to less than 5%. Like, is those 2% scenarios at all reasonable and possible?
I guess so. And, you know, in some ways, economists do try to do this. Again, we usually present a low, medium, and high case scenarios for growth. And in those low case or high case, we might bake into some of these possible scenarios like you're outlining, you know, like interest rates could do this, public sector union could do this. So we do sort of bake in there. But ultimately, people still come back to the economists and say, well, what's the base case, though? What's the most likely? And then you said, well, we think the most likely is whatever, even if there's sort of an equal probability of any of these things happening. But we'll say we think the most likely case scenario is, and we call that the base case scenario. But by doing that, you know, it sort of locks us back into, well, the economist said the economy is going to grow 3%. It's like, well, that actually isn't what we said. We said that is the likeliest scenario. But people want to take that. They just want one number. They want it sort of simple and then, you know, to go away with that one number.
But I guess what I'm suggesting, and maybe this isn't possible, but there are logical conclusions of specific events or actions. And maybe we're going to take a break and I'm going to ask you about some of those and what the potential impact could be. Fascinating conversation with Todd Hirsch, smart economist from Alberta, who's now an author and a public speaker. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Todd Hirsch. He is a former chief economist from a financial institution in Alberta. He also worked with the Bank of Canada. He's got an incredible academic background. He's a very smart guy. He's currently an author and a public speaker, and sort of semi-retired or early retired, but working like crazy, and decided during COVID that he was going to take this route, which is kind of fascinating and a whole different story. Todd, we talked about these scenarios, and I got into a fascinating conversation with a bunch of people last week that I'd like to ask you about. And the topic was investing in Alberta. And so I think that you would probably be an incredibly good person to talk about this with. And we were talking about, you know, a year and a half ago, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, oil prices were you know, down in the dumps, and oil investment was down in the dumps, and Alberta was not a great place to invest for a lot of people. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine had a very positive impact on oil prices and investment in Alberta, and things went well. And so people then said, well, to make a decision on investing in oil and or in Alberta today, you got to take a point of view on how long the war in Ukraine is going to last. And if you think peace is going to happen, then that's not positive for Alberta. And if you think war is going to continue, that is positive for Alberta. Does that make any sense?
Well, it's a great example of where geopolitics sort of intersects with economics, and it makes all kinds of wild scenarios. And again, getting back to what we were talking about before the break, how economic forecasting is really, really difficult. If someone could tell me exactly what's going through Vladimir Putin's brain right now and when this war is going to end, it would maybe be easier to forecast. But I would suggest that even if we are to see in 2023, hopefully, an end to this horrible ground war in Ukraine, even if we were to see some sort of truce or, you know, Russia pulling out or, you know, calling it a draw, whatever, I don't think it changes the world oil price scenario, simply because even if the war ends, I don't think the rest of the world is going to go back to Russia and look at them as a reliable, trustable trade partner. I think that ship has sailed long ago. Even maybe before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, maybe we should have seen this coming. But I think this invasion has permanently put Russia on the outside of the rest of North America and Europe in terms of looking at Russia as a trade partner, which is a very different scenario than when we, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the late 80s and the 90s, Russia was now playing nicely in the sandbox with everybody else. We were building space stations with Russia. They had joined the World Trade Organization. They were now a G8 country. We added one more country. Russia seemed to be, playing nicely. This is all entirely gone now. And I think even if there is an end to the war, Russia is not going to be viewed as a reliable trade partner. And as a result, I think that, keeps oil prices more permanently higher than they would have been, Russia being the world's second largest oil producer.
What about climate change or unusual weather events? We seem to be having a lot lately, and some people say it's all because of climate change. Some people say, oh no, it's not. It's just variability. But how does that impact the economy?
Yeah, well, that's another, when I give my economic presentations, I talk about geopolitics, I talk about inflation, but the other big factor I think we need to sit up and pay attention to is more severe weather events. I'm not a climatologist, just like I'm not a geopolitical expert. So, forecasting the weather is definitely not my expertise. But the climatologists are telling us what we are seeing is not just more hurricanes and more floods and more drought and more heat and more all of the bad things. But it's not that there's more of these things, it's the severity of these things is intensified, and it is having an economic impact. Why this is happening, I guess there's lots of scope for debate. Is this related to carbon emissions and climate change? Is it related to something else entirely? I don't know. I believe that it is related to global carbon emissions and climate change that way. But that's not the point. I guess the point is we need to be anticipating more severe weather events and more economic disruptions as a result. We look at, on the east coast of Canada last fall, Hurricane Fiona. We look in 2022, the flooding in the lower mainland of BC. Even over Christmas, the winter storms that hit Toronto and Vancouver. So here you have Pearson Airport and YVR Airport in Vancouver, the country's two largest airports shut down for 4 days because of weather. That is unprecedented, and it has an economic impact.
You are in Alberta. One of the things that I think a lot of people are wondering about is what's going to happen in your election that's coming up in the short while. And you seem to have, two very extreme, different potential scenarios. You've got a Daniel Smith, UDP current government that could get reelected, and not a sort of mainstream, center government, but an NDP government that is a lot of people think the government in waiting. I understand that you've actually prepared some reports on this election and what should happen from an economic standpoint. What do you think the two different scenarios are, and what do you think the policies of the two different parties are?
Well, it is a fascinating election that we're in here in Alberta. Probably this is the most important election of an entire generation. For listeners who maybe aren't aware, up until about 2005, Alberta had very, very stable, very consistent government. It was a progressive conservative government for 44 years, unbroken. But then the spell was broken. We did see a fracturing of the progressive conservatives, and we did see the NDP win power in 2015. Since then, between 2005 and now, I think we've had like 6 premiers. And it's just been a wild time for politics in Alberta. This election is going to be about the future of Alberta. The UCP government, the current government, is sort of the remnants of the old progressive Conservatives and what here in Alberta, the Wild Rose Party, a very socially conservative, very fiscally conservative government, sort of, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they would sort of be along the lines of the Donald Trumps, of the Ron DeSantis in Florida, more social conservatism. They are currently in power in Alberta, but there's a lot of dissatisfaction with them, particularly in the two big cities, Edmonton and Calgary. Wanting her former job back is leader of the NDP, Rachel Notley, who was the premier between 2015 and 2019. She wants her job back. I would argue, though, that Alberta's NDP party is not like the NDP party that most of your listeners in Ontario, or for that matter, anywhere in Canada, would sort of recognize. Alberta's NDP party is a very centrist, much more business friendly than perhaps other NDP parties would be. The rest of the country would really call Alberta's NDP more of a liberal party in that it's much more centrist. And there's a lot of appeal. A lot of Albertans are looking for the NDP to return to power. But the polls are saying this is going to be a nail biter. And it's very divided between rural Alberta and urban Alberta. And I think I'm hoping it doesn't get nasty, but I'm anticipating the next 4 weeks here in Alberta leading up to the election at the end of May. I'm hoping that it doesn't get nasty, but there is a lot of unhappiness on both sides, those supporting the UCP, the social conservatives, versus those more progressives who are looking to the NDP.
I understand you live in Calgary. What I've heard is that Edmonton is going to go NDP and that rural Alberta is going to go UCP. And so therefore it's going to come down to just a few ridings in Calgary that are going to make the decision as to which way the government goes. Is that right? And if so, what's your assessment?
That is correct. Well, that's what the pollsters are telling us. And I'm not a pollster, but I love listening to them. Janet Brown, particularly, she's the most well-known and the most well-respected pollster here in Alberta. It is going to come down to Calgary and probably a handful, probably 6 or 8 ridings in Calgary. Which way they are going to go is going to, take the election. Very unlikely that we're going to see a landslide for either party. But there's also no middle ground. There is really an absence of third or fourth parties. I mean, they're out there, but none of them are running a full slate of candidates across the province. None of them in really any kind of scenario. They have no chance of winning a seat. The Alberta party, that was the one party. It's still running. It has a possibility of maybe winning a seat, but even that would be a miracle. So it comes down to 2 parties. It's a binary choice for most Albertans. And the legislature is going to look very, very close either way. So I don't know, the next 4 weeks we'll have obviously a lot more information. A lot can happen during an election campaign to swing the tide either way towards the back towards the UCP or more in favor of the NDP. It's going to be a fascinating election to watch.
Okay, so if you were advising a Toronto businessman or business lady thinking about investing in Alberta, what are the 2 different scenarios and which should they prefer? Which is better or worse for investment in Alberta?
Well, I'm a little bit biased because a lot of your listeners might know, or if you do a quick Google search, I am, publicly supporting the NDP, and I have been doing some volunteer work for them, writing some of their economic platform or helping them with their economic platform. So I am biased, but I would say, honestly, if either party wins, there's going to be people unhappy here in Alberta, but in either scenario, Alberta is going to remain a great place in which to invest. I don't think we should overstate either a UCP win or an NDP win, changing it all that much. Yeah, I think the UCP, they put some challenges in place. They have this Alberta Sovereignty Act, which, if if you really read into the act, it basically says, Alberta does not need to follow federal laws and federal rules if we don't want to. It can seem a little alarming for an investor, because that really presents a potentially unsettled or a destabilizing environment when we don't know what the provincial government might do if they don't like a federal law. On the other hand, somebody might say, well, the NDP, even if it's not in their platform, the NDP, they're always going to raise taxes on us. This is the perception that some people have. And therefore, as an investor, I don't know if I want to invest in Alberta. I don't think we should overstate too many of those sort of worst case scenarios with either party. I think at the end of the day, if it's the UCP or the NDP, Alberta is going to remain a good place in which to invest. We've got a very dynamic economy here. We've got a bright, educated, entrepreneurial population. We are the fastest growing province in terms of interprovincial migration, international migration. So all of those add up to Alberta, regardless of who is in power at the end of May. It's going to be a great place in which to invest.
So in the 1960s, Montreal was the economic capital of Canada. And then with the election of the Parti Québécois, and it was more extreme because of the FLQ crisis and language laws and things like that. But because of threats of separation and those other things, capital businesses, employees, people left Montreal, moved to Toronto when Toronto became the economic capital. You don't see any of that risks with a UDP, a Sovereignty Act, a potential, separation, all that kind of stuff. It's not that extreme that it could be economically devastating to Alberta.
Not yet. And I have to be careful, because I don't know what Premier Smith is thinking at this point. She is not a separatist. She sees a strong Alberta within a strong federation within Canada. However, there is no question that there are people within her party, the rank and file within the UCP membership, that would see separation as the second best alternative. In other words, if the UCP win power again and Ottawa does something that Alberta doesn't like, and Danielle Smith says, well, there's not too much we can do, you can be guaranteed that that rank and file within the UCP party would say, all right, this is it. Now is the time to separate. We're going to call for a leadership review. We're going to throw Danielle Smith under the bus because they've done this in the past with other leaders. And it's possible that that separatist faction within the UCP party starts to steer the ship. I don't think that is the likeliest scenario, but we would be foolish in Alberta if we discount that possibility. And like you said, I think it would be economically disastrous for Alberta.
Fascinating conversation. It's going to be interesting campaign to watch. I'm going to have to check back in with you to see how things go. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with a last few minutes, in just 2 minutes, with Todd Hirsch. Smart guy, smart economist in Calgary. Stay with us, everybody.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Todd Hirsch. He's a economist, author, public speaker out of Calgary, Alberta. Very smart guy. He's written an article very recently. I commend it to you in the Globe and Mail, talking about how predictions are difficult to make today. And he says that economists really have hubris if they make the predictions. It's a fascinating discussion, because all of us, I think, actually think that these economists are brilliant people that can predict exactly what's going to happen. We listen to them way too much, and we base many decisions on their advice in that regard. I got to ask you, Todd, your provincial premier, Danielle Smith, came out this week and announced a sizable provincial government support of building an arena in Calgary, a new arena for the Calgary Flames. And, your mayor previously, Nenshi, when was it, 5 years ago, had an opportunity to support an arena, turned it down, and offered some money, but not nearly as much money as the Flames wanted. And the city is giving some money, But I think this is the first time in a while that a provincial government has come in to offer substantial additional money. And their justification was that this is good for the economics of Calgary from an economic development standpoint. So you're an economist. What do you think? Do arenas for NHL teams benefit the economy of the city they're in?
Well, it's really a coincidence that all of this, all of a sudden, provincial government being interested in helping get an arena deal done happens during a provincial election campaign. I mean, this is all politics all day long when it comes to, Premier Smith and this announcement that now the province is kicking in money. Now, I guess to be clear, the Premier Smith would say, well, hold on, we're not funding the arena. What we are doing as a province is helping fund some of the infrastructure around the arena area, some street improvements, some overpasses and different things, infrastructure. But it is helping get this, for sure, getting this arena deal over the line between the city, the owner of the Calgary Flames, and now the province as a partner on it.
Do you think it makes sense?
I don't know. I mean, I really have to plead a little bit of ignorance because I don't know all of the details, and I'm not a specialist in these arena deals. What I do find like astounding, though, is that every city goes through this at some point. Edmonton went through this 8 years ago. Winnipeg's been through this. American cities, I know it's a little bit different with their structure, but every city at some point needs a new arena. And every time it's the same, it's the same novel being rewritten. It's the public, it's the city hall battling with the owner of the billionaire hockey team owners to build a playhouse for millionaires to play hockey and people who have a lot of money to pay tickets to watch them play. It's the same story. Why is there no sort of set kind of standard? Here's the way you do it. Here's the precedent set. We're all going to agree that this is the best way to do it. Why does it always need to be all over again? The owner of the hockey team threatening to move the team to a different city if they don't get all the concessions. Taxpayers howling in protest because far too much of tax dollars are going to build these arenas, these playhouses for the millionaires and billionaires. I don't know why it needs to be over and over again the same story, but here we are in Calgary rewriting the story that Edmonton went through about 8 years ago.
Todd Hirsch, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. Last question, and you may not be able to or not want to answer, but let me ask you anyway.
All right.
This year, recession or no recession?
I think we will see a very modest recession in Canada. That's my prediction. It might be so modest that most people kind of miss it, but I think in a statistical way, when all of the beans are counted in a couple of years, I think 2023 will go down as being a modest recession year, but nothing catastrophic. That's my prediction.
Nothing catastrophic. You heard it first from expert economist Todd Hirsch, and we can count on this because we know that economists.
You must be right.
Todd Hirsch, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you. That's our show for tonight, everybody. One thing you can count on, at least for a while, is I'm on every night at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Calgary, at saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Really fun, Todd. Thanks. Bye.